New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is pleased to present The Inclusive Church, Ideas and Resources for Leaders of Multicultural Ministries. The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Tuesdays at 12 noon Mountain Time. Join Tracy and her guests as they go deep and share practical tips and resources you can use in your ministry. And now let's explore the Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown.
Boom! There she is, Tracy Brown. And I want to welcome you to the Inclusive Church show right here on the New Thought Media Network. Every Tuesday at noon Mountain Time, we come together, and sometimes I have a guest, and sometimes I just give you some resources and tools and ideas to think about, and all within service or with the intention to serve your desire to create a spiritual community where oneness does not require sameness, and you actually value and use all the ways diversity shows up in order to actually model and demonstrate the principles of love, unity, harmony, and wholeness. At the top of every show, I try to remember to mention two things, because if you're here for the first time, it may be a little confusing to you. So one thing I always try to mention is that even though I'm using the word church, I am not talking about a piece of property, a building. I am talking about the people who come together to learn, practice, and share spiritual truth. So, Inclusive Church, I'm reclaiming the word church from a building. And a lot of us believe the church was the people all along, and it's nothing new. But for those people who were thinking the church implies a building, maybe a building with a steeple or a mosque or a temple or a synagogue, like the property itself, if COVID didn't teach us anything else, the pandemic taught us that it was not the building that we could rely on. The building was just one tool in our commitment to bring people together, one tool or resource in our desire to teach and practice spiritual principle and religious beliefs. So, inclusive churches, we're talking about the people. And you will hear me constantly refer to, if you are a leader in a spiritual community. And I had someone after the first show text me and say, well, I really liked what you talked about in the first show, but I guess this is not for me. And I'm like, no. Why do you say that? And he said, well, you kept saying leaders in spiritual communities, and I'm not a minister. And I didn't laugh out loud until after I finished the text conversation, but I was laughing inside because I'm like, oh, there are still people who think a leader in a spiritual community has to be a minister. I'm all for ministers being leaders, but almost every minister I know would say that there are dozens of leaders in their community. And in fact, if they were the only leader, they would not have a ministry. They would not have a community, especially the larger their community gets. So you're a leader. If you are coordinating a project, if you are leading a volunteer team, if you are on the board, if you are teaching a class, if you are attending on a regular basis and giving input, you are a leader. All right, so that's my 3 minutes of required announcements. Let's get into what we're going to talk about today. So today, as I am talking with you and interacting with you, today is June 18th, which means tomorrow is June 19th, which means tomorrow is Juneteenth. And I've had several people ask me in the last couple of weeks questions about Juneteenth, that even though it is now a national holiday in the US, there are still a lot of people who are unsure about what Juneteenth is, what is it about, and whether they should, quote unquote, should or should not celebrate Juneteenth. So I'm going to say right up front, I don't know that anybody should celebrate Juneteenth just in terms of language, that we honor Juneteenth, or I often say, this is what I'm doing today because I'm inspired by the meaning of Juneteenth, or this is what I'm planning to do because I want to honor Juneteenth. And I'm not saying no one should celebrate it. I said I'm not sure if anyone should. I do believe that there is some celebration that is appropriate, especially if your family has had a history and is coming from the history that is directly tied to enslavement. And honestly, I mean that for people whose ancestors were enslaved, but also people whose ancestors were enslavers, were the people who owned the plantation or who owned slaves, because Juneteenth is that moment, or a moment, one of the many moments in our history where this country took a stand for the end of and moving toward not only the end of slavery, but the commitment to freedom for all. So that will give you a little bit of kind of a preview of where we might be going in today's conversation. And yes, it is a conversation where I don't have a featured guest. So again, those of you who have been watching on a regular basis can assume that I will be going for 30 to 35 minutes instead of 50 to 55 minutes, because I don't want to bore you. So let's get to it. What is Juneteenth? Juneteenth is the day, June 19th in 1865, is the date that General Granger, representing the United States, brought troops, a few hundred people, a few hundred soldiers, a few hundred troops, through the Gulf of Mexico to land in Galveston, Texas, and then read a proclamation that affirmed that, effective immediately, those who had been enslaved, that there was no longer a property and property owner relationship between the enslavers and those who were enslaved. Now, that's what Juneteenth represents. And the most common misconception about Juneteenth is that it marked the end of slavery in the US. That is actually not true. Slavery did not really officially end until December of 1865, when the 13th Amendment was re-ratified after the Civil War. So people are like, what? Wait, what do you mean? The Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863 ended slavery. No, it didn't. It was a proclamation that Abraham Lincoln signed that declared all of the people who were enslaved in the states that had seceded, in the states that were at war with the Union, must be freed. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation did. So all the people who were enslaved in the northern states or in the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation actually didn't have anything to do with them. Although some people did take that on and say, in the spirit of this, we shouldn't have slaves either, but it did not make it the law of the land. And are you surprised that the Confederate States said, Abraham Lincoln, we're at war with you. Who are you to tell us what to do? So what the Emancipation Proclamation did was it said, this is the law of the land. You are revolting against the law of the land, but from the Union perspective, you are still a part of the land. And we are saying these slaves must be and can be freed. And it was a Union strategy. So a lot of people who were enslaved, especially men, came north and then fought for the Union. So it created more troops because in the north they would be free. So that's kind of the behind the scenes story we don't talk about very much around the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't apply to everyone. And Lincoln didn't really have authority to demand or declare anything for the Confederate States technically, since they had said we have seceded from the Union. And that's what we are fighting for. We are fighting for our right to secede from the Union. So that's that. And then in January of 1865 was when the Constitutional Amendment was passed and ratified, that now this is the end of slavery. The practice of slavery has been abolished or is being abolished as of January 1865. But again, there's that little backstory. The Civil War was still going on. And so when the Union, when the senators and when the people running the country, running the Union, the United States, passed the Constitutional Amendment, you still had these states who are out there saying, hey, guess what? We don't want to be a part of you and your laws. And so we're fighting to be separate. So the Constitutional Amendment is dated January 1863, but the Civil War didn't end until January of 1865, but the Civil War did not end until April of 1865. So instead of thinking that, those poor enslaved people in Texas, they didn't get the news that they were free until almost 2.5 years later from the Emancipation Proclamation. It tells a really good story if we want to have victims and heroes and villains beyond the drama triangle. But think about it this way. The Civil War ended. The Confederate States conceded in April of 1865. So yes, the Union then did know it was going to need to enforce the law of the land, which was the end of slavery as the constitutional amendment required from January of that year. And they got together, some troops, and they put them on a ship, and they had them go around, down the East Coast and around under Florida into the Gulf. And, a little more than 2 months later, in mid-June, General Granger showed up in Galveston. And Texas was the furthest west of the Confederate States. And so I'm not exactly sure. I haven't been able to document why was the, why was Proclamation number 3 delivered in Galveston? Had there been proclamations 1 and 2 and 5 and 6? Were there people going to all the states? But we know about what happened in Galveston because the people of Galveston and the previously enslaved people of Texas really beginning the next June of 1866 to celebrate this change in status, even though life was still very hard. And so that's the kind of the history and a couple of pieces that are confusing for folks. But once you know that, it's like, follow the timeline. And then since the Civil War ended in April and new people were elected and brought into office, there was a decision made to re-ratify the 13th Amendment in December of 1865 because it was important that all of the elected leaders representing the Southern states or the Confederate states were re-ratifying, yes, this is law, and we are part of the Union or the United States, and it was re-ratified in December of 1865. So that's what actually ended slavery. Now, let's talk about, now we have some history and we're on the same ground with history. Let's talk a little bit about our spiritual communities today. Why would a spiritual community, a New Thought spiritual community, celebrate Juneteenth? So yes, it's a federal holiday now. And to a certain degree, how do you honor and represent other federal holidays and other secular holidays? This past weekend was Father's Day. There's nothing that is especially religious or spiritual about Father's Day, except that we choose to honor it and to honor people in our communities who are fathers or who have served as father figures for others. And I know many communities focus on the divine masculine for Father's Day and the divine feminine for Mother's Day. So in your community, you have to determine what is it that you would be honoring if you were to host programs or to include a nod to Juneteenth in your service. I would say for most of our spiritual communities, it's not about celebrating Juneteenth. It is about honoring Juneteenth. And for me, I think the easiest connect for most of our New Thought spiritual communities is to honor the spiritual meaning and the spiritual principle of freedom. And what does freedom mean to us? What do we teach about freedom in our spiritual communities? And we know that freedom is an inside-out job. We know that freedom is actually the freedom to choose what you do or the direction that your life takes. And celebrating freedom as a spiritual quality does allow us to honor the message and the meaning of Juneteenth and make a recommitment to freedom being known and experienced by all people, and that we can use our consciousness to reduce, interrupt, or eliminate the consciousness that allows people to create a hierarchy of freedom and to falsely believe that it's okay to own other people. And so it is really, there are so many ways that you can go under that umbrella of focus with freedom. Now, Ernest Holmes describes freedom as the understanding of capital T truth, infinite principle. And by understanding that truth, that is actually the emancipator, which basically, when I think about what I know about people who were enslaved in the US under the most horrific conditions, I know that there was an internal understanding of spirituality that was brought with them from Africa, knowing that spiritual truth, that they have been created by God, that they have been created from a blessing, even though the life they were experienced didn't feel like a blessing. But it is what Ernest Holmes talks about, understanding infinite principle, understanding infinite God, infinite good. That is what is the emancipator. So even if my ancestors had shackles attached to their ankles or chains connecting them one to the other at their wrists or around their necks, they knew. I mean, the people who jumped off overboard were like, no, not doing this, because I am free and I will choose A over B, and I will drown, and this physical body will die, and I will go back dust to dust, ashes to ashes, right? I will do that before I choose this. Or those who were living enslaved in the US and being treated very badly, I can handle this burden, because what they can't, what that master can't take away from me is my understanding that I am a creation of God, right? So I wouldn't be here today, I'm really clear about that, if my ancestors had believed the lie that freedom is something that can be given by certain people who had a certain amount of money or a certain amount of property, and that some other human being actually owned me, the inside, me, my soul. All of the people who invented things, all of the people who created goodness out of horror, were operating at a level of freedom that we can talk about in our spiritual communities. Ernest Holmes also writes in the glossary, real freedom means that humanity is created in the image of perfection and then left alone and allowed to make that discovery for themselves. So, yes, all of our spiritual communities can honor the principle of freedom and connect that to Juneteenth. Another comment that was asked of me was, should white communities, all white communities do anything with Juneteenth, because won't that be offensive to Black people? Like, Juneteenth is a Black holiday. Well, okay, you can probably guess where I went with that no, Juneteenth is about freedom, and we all can be committed to freedom. We all can be committed to freedom. And in fact, if we're in New Thought and we're into metaphysics, and we know that what we do and the consciousness that we use today individually and is contributing to collective consciousness, and that the collective consciousness we create today is laying the foundation for the next generation and the next generation, then I don't know about you, but I know for me, I want a whole lot of white people in the US talking about and honoring Juneteenth, saying, my ancestors may have owned slaves. And I am so glad that Juneteenth is now being celebrated as a national holiday, because my ancestry maybe didn't know better. That was the way things were, but I know better. And I want to honor the commitment that the United States of America made on June 19th, 1865, to declare and to transform into a country where there was no person who could be considered property. As a white person, if my ancestors owned slaves and came on a plantation, I would want to honor that Juneteenth is a moment in time where my ancestors had to take stock of the spiritual truth and not just comply. And if my ancestors didn't own property or were not part of the Confederate States, remember, there was slavery in the North as well. Just a little bit of a digression, especially for our metaphysicians and New Thought folks, please read Black Walden. So you more than likely know about Thoreau and Walden's Pond, and the insight and the insights that came from his staying at Walden Pond, and the solitude of it, and the self-sufficiency required of it, and the opportunity to commune with spirit as a result of living at Walden Pond for a year. So if you know about that, but you don't know about Black Walden, that Walden's Pond was really in an area where there was an established Black community, and it was an area that was remote and that was not well resourced, and people who had been enslaved were able to have land in that area because at that time no one wanted it. They didn't know what they could do with it. And much of what Thoreau learned, he learned from engaging with and interacting with or being taught by Black people who had found ways to navigate in that territory. But also in the book, and when you read the book, Black Walden, you get all this history about slavery in the Northeast that many people are not aware of, and how the family systems were connected. It's a great read. And so, yes, that's a slight digression from Juneteenth, but it is not just, it is important for us to remember, it is not just families who were in the South or families who were in Texas who had to, in 1865, commit to the spiritual truth of freedom, what it means. And today, in the 21st century, right, we're almost a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and we are still grappling with how do we ensure that everyone is treated respectfully? How Can we create spiritual communities where everyone is included, who wants to be included? How do we transform our assumptions and our prejudgments and our expectations so that we are collaborating with people who have a different cultural experience, but who are practicing and learning and teaching the same spiritual principles that we are or that we believe? So, if I were going to summarize and maintain my commitment to 30 to 35 minutes, I would summarize this way. Yes, Juneteenth, it's important to understand what it is so that you know what you're celebrating or honoring. 2, yes, spiritual communities, especially in New Thought, have a great opportunity to use Juneteenth to instill in people an understanding of the concept of freedom. And 3, whatever you do, make sure that you are grounding it in spiritual principle and in the philosophy, the values, and the teaching of your spiritual path. When we do this, whether it is with Juneteenth or whether it is with other holidays and holy days throughout the year, what we are doing is we are building the foundation for an inclusive church. My name is Tracy Brown. I'm so glad that you joined me today. Join me again next week right here on the New Thought Media Network at 12 noon Mountain Time.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.
On behalf of everyone at New Thought Media Network, thank you for being a member of our virtual family. Your financial contributions help share the New Thought message with people from around the world. Please visit and contribute at www.ntmedia.org/donate. New Thought Media Network, come be you. And please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, peace and blessings.